You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Hello, everybody. Al Bielawski here with another edition of Catholic Mysticism and Spirituality, where we talk about the mystical aspects of our faith, all things Catholic, and the interesting topics of our time and the times that we live in. And I hope you've been enjoying the shows, and God bless you for tuning in and listening. So today we're probably going to get a two-parter out of today's topic, because it's an interesting topic, I think, for this time, because it's the million-dollar question. Actually, it's probably $100 million question. Does God exist? And we see in the time we are living in now that many people, while still believing in God, the numbers are decreasing. And the number of atheists, agnostics, and the so-called nuns, those that have no religious affiliation, don't believe in any type of spirituality like that has to do with Christianity or Jesus or God the Father or any of that. So we see there's a big gap coming. And you see that in the vocations and the attacks on family. You see a lot of things happening in our society, and a lot of it is because it is, in my opinion, of course, that we have gotten away from God. We've gotten away from His basic commandments, His basic truths, and we pay for this. It's not like this is the first time this has happened to human beings. Certainly biblically, it happened to the Jewish people over and over and over again, where when they followed God and His commandments and tried to live good lives, good moral lives, they had blessings and they did well. And when they went against God and got caught up in their own business, they paid, and they paid dearly. This is nothing different. People are people, and we can see in our own time that things are playing out. And anyway, so it's an interesting question for many people, and it's an important question because I've mentioned on some shows before that we don't, of course, look at things the way past generations have. We don't certainly learn from them in many regards with our 21st century mindset that they have nothing, as the so-called ancients, well, call them, have nothing to teach us. And we also pay for that, because that's certainly not true. We can learn a lot from the past. And to look at our future, all we need to do is look at our past. So if we're going to get back on the right track, again, in opinion, we need to kind of back up a couple steps so we can get forward and get moving again and try and recapture some of the innocence and childlike wonder of our God and you and I as human beings and God's creation. And so this is an important question. And it's an important question now because you see a lot in the media that there's a so-called division between science and religion. And I'm not saying that there isn't. I don't see why that has to be, because science and faith can complement each other. It doesn't have to be one or the other. It could be an and or both. Certainly, there are reasons why many people, and scientists included, don't want to go to what we're going to, as we progress in the show, call this first cause or necessary being, and will do everything despite evidence and despite logic and reason. They're just going to go kicking and screaming that we're just not going to do that. We're just not going to do that. We're not going to call it this first cause. We'll do anything but go there. So you do see some of that. But as a Catholic Christian now, and Christians in general, really, our faith in God, our faith and reason and logic in science shouldn't have to have this division, and again, either or. It doesn't have to be that way because they both complement each other if we realize some things. That one, as I hope the show goes as we progress, that we can begin to use some logic and see that, yes, the answer to that $10 million question is God does exist. And the more we delve deeper into science, the more it is starting to lean and prove, and I use that term with quotation marks on the show because, and we'll get to this in a moment about what science can do and can't do, that there are reasons now to really believe that there was a first cause, a necessary cause, a being that has to be eternal, non-material, unchangeable, all-powerful and all-knowing and all-good. For all of this gift that we have of life, this universe, for it to have taken place. Now, one thing, a couple things quick right off the bat. One book, if you're interested in this, that I would strongly recommend, A Catholic Scientist Proves God Exists, by Dr. Gerard Verschuren. And I'll spell that. It's Verschuren. And then anything you can get with Father Spitzer on his great websites, the Magis Center, Credible Catholic, these are going to help you out. Because these are brilliant men, scientists, and Father Spitzer, obviously a priest. They're going to help you out in your quest for this. If this is something you find interesting and search for. But I'm going to keep this, fairly simple. Because we'll use a few technical terms, but I want to make this, comfortable and accessible for just, people like myself that are just average Joes. So, science. One thing, and I want to point out, too, as we begin, I am not coming down on science. Science has done some unbelievable things. And I mean, in my own case, without the scientific research years ago of like knee replacements and things like that into my doctor and all the cutting-edge stuff, I'd be in big trouble right now with the knee injury that I had. I mean, big trouble. I could maybe be in a wheelchair. And I can't sit here and knock some of the great things. I tell you what. As I getting older in my old age, I think I'm getting soft. I never used to mind the heat, never used to mind the cold, but I got to tell you, I like that air conditioning in the summer now, and boy, when I walk in the day on one of those 0-degree days, and that thermostat is kicking up, I like the heat. These are incredible things. We take a lot for granted, and science has done a lot of good things, So we don't want to knock it, because it's a good thing we have. It's a gift that is given to God. From God, and God has given us this gift of science and scientists and the education they have. But like all things that we have, we can get off track with it. Because one of the things that, for all those things science can do, it can't answer all our questions. And here I said we get back to this about proving with those quotation marks. Science can't prove God. And on the other hand, it can't disprove God. Because science deals with material things, in the things that are empirical, that we have, that they can see, that they can touch, that has material, and they come, and that's what they deal with. So it's tough because we're asking, when we ask, can you prove God exists, or questions like that, you're starting to talk about metaphysical things plus philosophical things, and that. Science, that's out of its realm to be, There is no way science on its own can prove that it has answers to all of our questions. I think as a base, that's a very important thing for us to start with. Now, we put our trust in science, which we should do, but we also have to be very careful. A lot of things we're hearing now, especially with the COVID and the vaccines, or that trust the science. And like I say, you do, but there's also a degree where you don't put all your eggs in one basket, because that's not a good thing. That's not a good thing at all. And again, science, it can't answer all our questions, because that's not really scientific in itself. There are things, like other ways of finding the truth. And there's no experiments that could do that for us, right? You can't test those type of ideas, those philosophical, metaphysical things in a laboratory or experiments with double-blind trials, whatever. So the bottom line with that is science on its own cannot answer questions that are beyond its scope. and again, beyond the reach of any empirical or experimental techniques. And you just can't do that. And so you need something else, because science does have, it's restricted in the very nature of its being scientific, in what it can be measured, what can be, counted, quantified, dissected. And that's the limitations. Because once you have those limitations, it's not something that can give all the answers. And that, therefore, is something that's really, really tricky. And that's why they can't answer all our questions. Again, another thing they have to do is, because we deal in science with the material, you have to have assumptions. And whether scientists are aware or not, the assumptions come before the science can get started, right? So you've got to have this to get going, because science can never explain what science itself takes for granted. So we've got to be careful with things like that. So those are some limitations that science has when dealing with the question whether God exists. Now, one interesting thing that we can look at when we look for these proofs, and another thing I should recommend too, as long as I mentioned Dr. Gerard's Verschuren's book and Father Spitzer's Magic Center, it's tough reading, is St. Thomas Aquinas, because he tackled these things long ago. So this will all, again, help you. Now, for us as Christians, we've got to be careful that we don't have a lot of false idols. And I think one of the problems that we have today in our society is this false leaning toward various idols. Now, they can be anything. Science certainly can be an idol. Again, right? Follow the sciences. If that's, with the vaccinations and the COVID, if that was the only thing, without really looking at, okay, what's moral here? What's philosophical here? What's the right thing to do in this case? Should we do this? Should we do lockdowns? Do we cause more harm? And not looking at a general well-being and an all-around good, it was, trust. And I'm not criticizing the people who did this or made the decision. I'm just saying that it was fast, and the decisions were made quickly, and they may not have looked at a lot of other factors. And again, so you can't put your eggs in all one basket, because, and this will, I guess, pay out over time. We'll find out how this all worked out, because, things are rapidly changing. Speaking of that, that's another thing I want to point out. Another limitation of science before we move on is that, over a period of years, that science, what was thought scientific and exact, we certainly know that in their demonstrations and the determinations, the history of science shows us that in many instances, it didn't pay out. The theories that were accepted at that time have now been either revised or discarded. And that's true for our own time. As time goes forth, we're going to see that. Vulcan, if you remember, if you know a little bit about science, in the 19th century, science believed that it existed. It was a planet between Mercury and the Sun. But, of course, it's not true. And, more recently, scientists believe that the size of the universe was an unchanging constant, and they learned that wasn't true. That the expanding Earth hypothesis, that continental drift could be explained by the fact that the planet was, again, growing larger, that's not true. And for a long period of time, years and years and years, it was believed that humans had 48 chromosomes, and it turned out that we have 46. So, there are a lot of cases like this. Even in our own time with the vaccination. Remember, it was going to be a end-all, catch-all to end this thing. And, of course, now, a year later, you see that, well, we've got to change the game plan. You can still give it, you can still catch it, but it'll keep you out of hospital. So things change. And that is, again, one of the reasons you can't just say, okay, we're going to follow the science of all this, and that's going to be the end-all. And in any aspect of our lives, we've got to be careful with doing that. Again, so in this regard, science can become a false idol. Well, and not to pick on science, but so can, say, sports. How many people do you know that their kids are into soccer or something like that, and they don't go to Mass on Sunday if you're a Catholic, and they bring the kids to soccer practice? So in a way, you see now going to worship Jesus on Sunday has been replaced by going to soccer practice. So these are things we've got to keep an eye on and watch over. Now, one thing that we can see when we look at God and we begin to look at these things is that there is several proofs that we can come up with. And we look at this existence that we can, if it can't come from science, because again, science deals with material. So we look at God and see that he's beyond that. Then science is an inductive enterprise. So scientific proofs, again, are never final proofs. I just mentioned some that were taken to be and certainly weren't. So we've got to look at God and we've got to use a deductive type of thinking in nature. And again, I mentioned this is metaphysical stuff, philosophical. Now, we look at this, and one of the things we can see is an argument for God's existence from that existence. We know the things, for instance, that the old question there, to be or not to be. We have things from a metaphysical point that are deemed being, right? Our being is an essence and an existence. And in our being, we can see that we have from those things, our essence and existence in this being, is that what and that are the terms we can use. Because our essence doesn't necessarily mean that we also have these answers that is an existing thing. Now, I just want to clarify that because that is confusing. So essence can be described as the what of a thing, okay? Not what that the thing is, but what is it? Because we know some things, like a mermaid, for instance, we know that they don't exist, but we know what they are, correct? So that essence of the mermaid is the what. We know that. Now, its existence, though, we say they don't exist. So this is a universal principle that makes material individuals. And that is what we need to reflect on, because it's actually a self-evident truth. What a thing is, and that a thing is, as I mentioned, they're completely different. Having an essence, like I mentioned the mermaid in that example, doesn't guarantee that that thing exists because of its essence. And a thing's existence, like you and I, is that we are. And that is obviously, it should be anyway, different from essence, what it is. So a thing's existence basically is that it is, and in essence is what it is. So this is a big distinction, because the act of existing is something, and that means, what is it? What is that thing that all existing things have? And the key is not a trick question, is that we exist. So each existing thing had to come into existence, and that's independent of its essence. So that's very, very important for us to stand, because that is itself, when we talk about these proofs, we need to, it's like, our Constitution, that these truths are self-evident. Right, life, liberty, happiness, endowed by their Creator. And we look at that and say, okay, now that should be a self-evident truth. What something is doesn't make it that it is. So in essence, is not the same as existence. That's pretty easy to see. So, with that being said, the next step we need to look at is we have to look and see, okay, so where does this existence come from? Now, did we cause ourselves to exist? No. We had to have parents. Now, no human being on earth is going to be his own father. So something gave us that existence, because there has to be a cause there, because we do not have the power to take it upon ourselves to make things exist. Nothing can generate itself. Just as children, as I mentioned, cannot be their own father. They cannot generate themselves. And is that a self-evident truth? And how would we know that? Well, for something to generate itself or produce itself, it would have to exist before it came into existence. Okay? So think about that for a minute. Let me repeat that, because it's pretty important when we look at this. For something to generate or produce itself, it has to exist before it came into existence. That is why I said we cannot become our own fathers, because we didn't exist before our parents. So we cannot cause ourselves to produce ourselves. And that is basically, that's a deductive form of reasoning. That's why I say this is how you start to look and see how God exists, because we look at that. So we look at that essence, we look at existence, we look that we can't generate ourselves because we'd have to exist before. And of course, that's ridiculous. We don't. We don't exist until our parents and the whole conjugal act and that beautiful moment of creation between God and the parents come to be. So we see this now. And we look for these causes. And when we look at this, what we need to do is look at the second part of that. So if we can't cause our own existence, and let's just agree on that, I think it's pretty self-evident truth. But there's another thing here that's kind of a part two with that, and that's that anything for you and I, it's impossible that anything that has come into existence is self-explanatory. Not the universe, not you and I, and not even matter itself. And we can see then, we need to look at not just as everything that comes into existence as a cause, but to everything that also comes into existence, does it have an explanation? So we need to search for those explanations. And that basically boils down to is, why is there something rather than nothing? Why? Why is there existence? Why is there something instead of not existence? And how can we explain it, since we can't explain you and I existing or anything else that I just mentioned, matter or the universe or anything? So these are important things for us to look at when we are trying to use our faith and reason, because already we can see some limitations of science. Now, science, again, cannot explain what I'm saying is necessary or not. Why is the universe the way it is? Why wasn't it complete chaos? Why is there existence? Why is there just nothing? Why? And when we start to look at that, and we go back, we need to look and see that there may be something necessary. So in order for our existence to be explained with a reason that why the world exists, why we exist, why things are the way they are, there's only one thing that can explain that. Something outside, something that is necessary, something that is a cause, something that knows the explanations of why and something that we call God. So you see, through some philosophical, metaphysical, logic, reasoning of self-evident truths, and these are not hard to grasp. I hope they're not, anyway. I hope I'm making it clear that all of a sudden there's something outside of ourselves here that has the ability to cause existence that was before to produce things into existence, and then has the ability to explain why it's necessary, why it is the way it is. Now, and again, I mention that is God. Now, today, one of the things, and this is what I say, some of the scientists go down kicking and screaming before they'll try to go and use the God word, that we look at some people, and science has changed a little bit. That says, in a way, I think it's a very far stretch. That laws of nature, okay, and what I mean by that is that they look and see that, well, the universe itself, rather than let's look and talk about God, let's look at the universe itself and the laws of nature as the ultimate explanation for all that exists. And so they may say, well, there's a law such as gravity, and the universe can and will create itself from nothing. And then you've got something that they call spontaneous creation, and that's the reason there is something rather than nothing. But how can that be? How could you use the universe to explain its own existence if what we just said is a self-evident truth, that nothing that is in existence can explain it? And as far as the gravity, that can't do it. Because before the universe existed, we would have had to have laws of physics in place, which would set the laws that govern the existing universe. And how can that be? Because the laws of nature then would presuppose the very existence of the universe. So they can't be used to explain the existence of in the universe. You can't have, again, remember what we said with the self-generation, you can't have a set of laws already existing to use that and say, well, this is what happened, and that's why the universe was caused to exist in the way it was. Because what happens here is you look and see, well, wait a minute, what caused those laws of nature in the first place? What generated those? What came before those? So you see what they used to call, well, they do still call it, circular reasoning. And again, another thing is that the laws of nature could have been anything other than they are. They could exist or they couldn't exist either, right? We said that. Why are things the way they are? They could have been this or that. And, there's endless ways in which the universe could have been totally chaotic. It could, it may have had no laws at all, just an incoherent jumble of stuff that caused matter to behave in a disorder or unstable ways. But we know that's not true. And we know if you listen to, Father Spitzer and the Magic Center, they come down with the fine-tuning of the universe. It's fascinating that if something like, say, with a hydrogen molecule or something that caused water, if it's off just a tinch, something thinner than a piano wire, it doesn't exist. And therefore, we don't either. But we find what? That the universe has very specific law and order. In other words, the universe does not have to behave the way it does. And therefore, we look back and see that then what explains it and can explain it is only a self-explanatory, necessary being, which we can call God, because he can explain why the laws of nature are the way they are. You have to have these things. These laws that we were just talking about are not self-explanatory. Because if there's no necessity for the universe to exist, then the universe, including everything in it, can't be self-explanatory. And it has to have an explanation outside of itself. And that's important for us to realize. Because, again, the universe and these laws, they can't be the necessary being. And that is one thing we have to look at. Because if you look and say if it was, and it had to exist necessarily, then the universe could not be different from what it is. But, everything about it could be deduced by pure thought without any need for observation or explanation. So we would have the answers to why this is, why the universe is it is. And we know we don't. We know we don't. So we can't make the claim that you can deduce this by pure thought, the universe, because we'd have all these answers. So that doesn't cut it. And again, it's a philosophical issue. We've got to be careful with this. So, even Stephen Hawking himself, who believed, about gravity creating the universe, he actually asked that what breathes fire into the equation makes the universe for us to describe. The usual scientific approach of constructing a mathematical model cannot answer the question why there should be a universe for the model to describe. So, again, the question came down, that he asks, is why does the universe go to all the bother of existing? And, that's the old, why is there something rather than nothing? So, again, here's a gentleman, Stephen Hawking, rest his soul, that also was questioning that. Why does this exist? So we look at that then, and we look at this from an argument of an essence. So the next thing we want to take a look at when we're looking to see if prove that God exists, so to just recap that really quick, that we look at essence, what a thing is, existence, that it is, why it is that way, that it beings, our existence, and everything in it cannot be, anything that exists cannot be self-explanatory, and we cannot produce or generate ourselves, for we would have had to exist before we actually were able to do those things. Again, we would have to exist before our parents came together, and we can't be our own dad. So when we look at that, and we use reason in these self-evident truths, we look at that and say, okay, why is there existence? Why is it the way it is? And how do we explain this? And because we can't do this, and science can't do this either, we can then go and take the next step, this metaphysical approach, this philosophical approach, and say, okay, then we are dealing with something here that is outside of our existence, something that is necessary for our existence, something that caused that existence, and something that can explain that existence. So that is how we get from that argument to the first step, what we call God. Now, some scientists they don't want to use this term either, but they're getting there, first cause or necessary being. But again, they really try to fight. Not all of them. Actually, Father Spitzer had an interesting thing that many, especially young scientists and physicians, are believers in God. And more percentage now of scientists and physicians are believing in the God of Christianity, Jesus. So I think it's fascinating. But so that's where we're going to leave today's program. And we're going to pick it up the next time on what we can look at from, as we looked at today, the proof from existence and essence and self-explanation. We're going to look at what we call contingency. So I hope you enjoyed today's show, and you tune in, and then we'll talk about the next proof that we can make of God, that is from our ourselves being contingent and everything in this universe on who we call God. So until the next time, I wish you all of God's blessings, and have a great night, and God bless.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization, and don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.